Thanks for joining us here at the Shaping Opinion podcast. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know about another podcast you may like. It's called Within the Realm, hosted by Steve Garrett. It's a great storytelling podcast that mixes interviews with Steve's homespun style. He focuses on the people in the story rather than the other way around. The people are the story. The people are accessible, thought-provoking, and inspiring. Steve wants to give you something you can take away after listening, something that sticks with you. Inspiration, knowledge, or just a little entertainment. Within the Realm can be found on all major podcast channels. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Dan, when you heard of the Domino's video, did that affect the way you ordered pizza?
No, I don't think so. I think that the video made me understand, as any PR person did, I think it made us understand the power of social media as a controlled mechanism for reaching a broad audience. And so I was looking at it through that prism and not through a consumer's perspective.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Dan Keeney. He's a fellow crisis communicator, and he previously joined us for episodes 5 and 6 to talk about that classic Tylenol crisis case study. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Dan about the time when two Domino's pizza employees created a viral YouTube video that represented a new era for crisis management, the age of the social media crisis. It was on an Easter Sunday in Conover, North Carolina. Business was slow at the local Domino's restaurant. In order to entertain themselves, two Domino's employees, one male and the other female, came up with an idea that involved their kitchen, a video camera, and YouTube. That's when the two decided to create videos of themselves tampering with food that allegedly was to be delivered to customers. Christy Hammonds captured video of Michael Setzer sticking cheese up his nose and then putting it on a sandwich. He was also captured performing other health code violations. Then they decided to upload the videos to YouTube for the world to see. It didn't take long. By Wednesday of that week, the video had been seen more than 1 million times on YouTube. The Domino's brand name was dominating Google search results for all the wrong reasons. Domino's would fire the two on Tuesday, and on Wednesday they would be facing felony charges on grounds of delivering prohibited foods. Later that year, the New York Times talked to Domino's spokesperson Tim McIntyre. Here's what he said at that time, quote, "We got blindsided by two idiots with a video camera and an awful idea. Even people who have been with us as loyal customers for 10, 15, 20 years, people are second-guessing their relationship with Domino's, and that's not fair. In 2019, it's no longer uncommon for someone to behave badly on video or social media, and a brand has to defend itself. But this case was, if not the first, it was the biggest of its kind to usher in the era of the social media crisis. Today we're going to talk with our colleague, Dan Keeney, to break it all down. Dan, welcome back to the podcast. We have another classic PR disaster to talk about today. Have you ever had to handle a social media crisis?
Yes. Yeah. And it's no walk in the park. And anybody actually who does a very detailed search of my name and my firm's name will see me come up because in a lot of the backlash that happens online, there isn't a stone left unturned.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
I really don't.
Okay.
No, what happened, and all I can do is, I'm sitting here shrugging, you can't see me, but all I can do is continue to profess my innocence. But what happened is that I had a conversation with a small business that was experiencing a very unpleasant series of blog posts and I was not engaged by them at the time, but I was acting with a great deal of naivete. After my discussion with them, I reviewed the chatter online and I participated in it. I subsequently became engaged by them and then was outed as a PR hack who was out there trying to argue on behalf of his client, without disclosing the relationship. So,
in other words, you were accused of being a plant.
yes, and all of this was fairly new to me, but I tried to explain that I was not operating on behalf of the client when I was out there, participating in the debate. So anyway, it was awful.
Well, I've never heard anyone say that a social media crisis wasn't awful, and I've dealt with a few. Nothing, obviously, not as big as the Domino's case, but anytime you deal with social media crises, well, first off, you actually have to wonder, is it a crisis? Because sometimes it's just a flare-up and people overreact to it, but other times it is a crisis. And it happens in real time, and it's like Jello. You can't contain it. It just wants to go. You squeeze it in one direction, it goes another direction. But I do want to ask you about the Domino's YouTube fiasco, because that may not have been the first social media crisis, but it was, how I describe it here is, it ushered in the era of the social media crisis. What was it about the YouTube crisis that made it different, that Domino's YouTube crisis?
Well, I think from my point of view, it was the Domino's strategic decision to use the same channel as was being used against them to communicate on behalf of themselves. That's a poorly worded way of saying it, but I think that really, as much as anything, what made that stand out was the decision to put their CEO on YouTube.
Well, let's get into the situation now. Domino's had two employees, a male and a female, Christy Hammonds and Michael Setzer. They got themselves into trouble thanks to a video camera and YouTube. I recapped this in the intro to this episode. Now we start to look at the PR disaster aspect of this. Their video was seen over 1 million times on YouTube in those first few days. The head of PR at Domino's, his name was Tim McIntyre. At the time, he said that their brand suffered damage. The research firm, YouGov, conducts online surveys of 1,000 consumers every day on perceptions around hundreds of brands. According to YouGov's brand index, the YouTube video crisis for Domino's did some damage. So I have a question for you, Dan. How does an incident like this, a social media incident like this, affect a brand? What's your first concern for a brand when something like this happens?
I think that any business is going to primarily be concerned with the long-term viability of the brand. When you have people lose faith with the brand, all bets are off. And we saw it later with Chipotle, with what is easily arguably a much more serious situation, since their situation was more institutional and endemic throughout the restaurants. But
in Chipotle, their problem was food poisoning, really. They found E. coli in some of their products.
Well, it's not just E. coli, it's the fact that their systems and their sourcing was such that they were very susceptible to E. coli. So it wasn't that it was just one restaurant or a number of restaurants or a batch. It was that their system was very vulnerable. And so this was a case where you just had, idiots working at a restaurant who are misbehaving, whereas there are other situations that are much more, troubling from a restaurant's point of view. But both of them, it all goes back to consumer trust. And if people lose trust or lose faith in the brand, then you're likely to lose a great deal of market momentum. So you just want to stay viable as a business so you can make your way through these problems.
Well, I thought you made a great point drawing a distinction between Chipotle and this Domino's situation, because Domino's, as you mentioned, it was just one restaurant and it was two employees. And as sensational as it wasn't a systemic problem, whereas Chipotle had that systemic problem. Let's talk about this situation and just break it down. Tom McIntyre, who we mentioned, their PR chief, he was alerted to the videos on a Monday evening, the day after Easter. Christy Hammonds is heard in one of the videos, and here's what she says. She says, quote, "In 5 minutes, it'll be sent out to delivery where somebody will be eating these. Yes, eating them." And little did they know that this cheese was in his nose and there was some lethal gas that ended up on their salami. That's how we roll at Domino's. What do you do? I mean, how would you react if you were Tim McIntyre and you see this video the day after Easter and you know you're going to have to deal with this?
Well, let's put a timeline on this too, because this was a decade ago. So this was back in 2009. So this very much a decade later. I think that people's expectations are completely different because, as you say, the Domino's became aware of it on Monday, but it was posted on Sunday. So much more sophisticated media, social media monitoring capabilities today that are very well embraced with the big companies and the big brands. It's much more likely that you would, within minutes or certainly within hours, be alerted to something like this. So the fact that this was up and available for a whole day, and actually I think Advertising Age had run a story, had published a story about this, which might have played a role in Domino's first learning about it. But so how would I respond was your question. And I guess the answer to that is you would bring people together and consider the facts and take immediate action. I can't say that I would have responded a lot differently than Domino's did in terms of just trying to take care of this as quietly as possible and as quickly as possible. I'm trying to be honest with you, Tim, because it's easy to say, oh, I would have gone public right away and issued a statement, but I don't know that I would in reality, because if you can quietly extinguish a problem, that's always going to be my first hope. And once that doesn't work, then I'll be much more likely to want to issue a public statement. And we certainly would put together a holding statement, have everything ready to go kind of in the background. And I think that's very similar to what Domino's actually did.
Those are all good points, because one of the things they knew right out of the gate was this was one restaurant. So if you can isolate it, you want to do that, because it's isolated in terms of the food safety and the customer safety. It wasn't isolated, though, in terms of perceptions because of the YouTube influence. So let's talk about how they found out what restaurant was involved and who was involved. There was a site called consumerist.com that was instrumental in identifying the offenders. We also know that Tim McIntyre, as soon as they found out about this, they sent out an internal message to all of their restaurants nationwide with pictures asking basically, do you know these people and do you know what restaurant this is? So they were actively trying to find that out behind the scenes. But on the internet, there were actually site visitors to this consumerist.com site. One site visitor was a woman by the name of Amy Wilson. She was a grad student at Georgetown University, and she worked with her boyfriend, Jonathan Drake, to identify the two people. After spotting the story that was on Consumerist, they noticed that there was a Jack in the Box sign visible from a window in the video. So she and her boyfriend, Drake, and he analyzes satellite images for a nonprofit, so he has a skill set. They used that and other clues to assemble a street view. And then they assembled this street view and they started to search Google satellite images for locations that matched. They looked for locations that had basically a Domino's and a Jack in the Box close to each other. Then there was a third person on this site. Her name was Paris Miller. and she was from northern Kentucky, and she was a computer consultant. She traced one of Hammond's friends to Conover, North Carolina. So this was some pretty intensive forensic work on the part of these visitors to this site. But between the three of them, they found out basically that this was the Domino's restaurant in Conover, North Carolina. And not long after that, they found out who these people were. And as you mentioned, this all happened pretty quickly. And Domino's was trying to play it below the radar at first. On Tuesday, the Domino's franchise owner in Conover fired Hammonds and Setzer. Both employees were in their 30s. They weren't kids. And the franchise alerted the local health department and did all the right things. The health department told them to throw away open containers of food. So really, from a consumer safety standpoint, they did all the right things, and it really wasn't a big problem. It didn't even cost them a lot of money in terms of the amount of food they had to throw away. But from a brand perspective and a perceptions perspective, that was where the problem was. Now, what would you say in today's terms? What do you think would happen today if this thing started to transpire on Easter Sunday? How much different would it be now than it was then?
I think with the ubiquity of other social tools, certainly Facebook was being used back then, but it was not as ubiquitous as it is today. Twitter is more powerful today than it used to be. The ability of people who have free time to do the kind of sleuthing you just mentioned is just as robust, probably with greater tools today. So I would imagine that it would have much more just evolved much more quickly. And I think that the uproar would have, because the mainstream media relies in a way, multitudes more on social media for their ideas and content today than they did back in 2009. I think that it would have become a staple of whether it's Good Morning America or the evening news. I mean, it's just highly likely, I think, that's another big wrinkle that would be different today than it was back then. So I think it would have blown up faster, and Domino's would have had their hand forced more quickly than they did.
One of the things it's actually two things. First off, this was only 10 years ago. We're talking about this almost like it's ancient history, but 10 years is not that long ago for there to have been such a major change in the communications landscape. But 10 years ago, just to give you an idea of how primitive things were then compared to now, is in 2000, this is 2009, Twitter was only founded in 2006. Facebook only opened to everyone in 2006. So this is only 3 years after the very birth of major social media. And Instagram and Snapchat, for example, they hadn't even been invented yet. So the kinds of things that would help make a situation go viral today, the way it would go viral today, they just weren't there yet. Domino's, for its part, had just assembled a social media team only a month before, so they were only starting to think about online marketing and, in respect, online crisis management through that team only within that month. So they actually were developing a plan to get Domino's onto these social platforms. So they weren't really together yet. They didn't have a presence. But one of the first things I noticed, and you mentioned that today there would be monitoring. One of the first things I noticed when they did the monitoring of social media, Twitter specifically, the theme was, what's Domino's doing about it? What's Domino's doing about this situation? That would probably be the case today, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that people want to see action, and they want to see contrition, and they want to see people showing that they care and what changes they're committing to. And they also, to be brutally honest, that people want to see heads roll too. So, and that's something that's one of the more impressive aspects of this, is that their CEO was able to weather the storm. And not only that, but, I would argue that he used this as a little bit of a platform to move forward with their turnaround, which lasted them the next several years.
They really did, and they factored that into their advertising. some of the things you kind of mentioned, and I think they're worth mentioning right here, because at this point in the story, this is where it turns around. And that is, on Wednesday, Domino's creates a Twitter account called DPZ Info to address comments that were coming through on Twitter. On Wednesday, during the day, they created a YouTube video, as you mentioned, featuring the CEO responding very candidly and firmly to the event. They were very candid about their feelings about it, and definitely how they were going to pursue charges against the people that caused this problem. But they were also very adamant that the quality of Domino's product was not affected system-wide. So it was a very clear and firm message, with basically the CEO going on YouTube and saying the buck stops here with me. And he was very accountable, and I guess you could say very transparent. By comparison, for anyone that's not in public relations listening to this, they might say, well, why wouldn't he do that? That was the first time that a CEO went on YouTube to face a crisis like that. Prior to that, you might have just had a written statement or a press release about the situation and hoped that the media would cover it. Is that a model for CEOs now and for companies now, when there's a social media crisis or other crises, to go on and do a video, or maybe to do a multimedia response?
Oh, very much so. And that's probably going to be Patrick Doyle's most important contribution to corporate America, or the world's corporations, is his decision, his willingness to put himself out there. I mean, all you have to do is reflect on our current controversies. And I was struck to see the CEO of Boeing, for instance, front and center doing, and on the shop floor there, doing a very impassioned statement about the 737 MAX accidents. So yes, absolutely. This is a model. Forever, though, Tim, and you were involved alongside me, and I reported to you on some of our crises that we worked on back when we were at Ketchum back in the 90s. Forever, as long as I remember, we always advocated, assuming the crisis rose to a level of importance that justified it, having the highest levels of the company's leadership front and center to show that the organization was dealing with it with that level of seriousness. So it's, in that sense, having a CEO visible was always a staple of crisis response. It's just, what channel you use to do that, and having a CEO issue a video was fairly, novel.
Well, when you look at that video, Tim McIntyre, who was the spokesperson, I have a quote from him about that, because he said, "On Wednesday, we learned that Domino's, as a search term, had surpassed the search term Paris Hilton for the first time ever." That was their benchmark. And that got mainstream media's attention, he said. So they decided, let's focus on talking to the audience that's talking to us. And that's why they went on YouTube, because their theory was, yes, a lot of people know about this crisis, but the vast majority of them are coming to YouTube to see that video, the troubled video. So they may as well switch over and look at us at the same time. We'll talk to our audience because we know where they'll be. They'll be on YouTube. And they also put information on their own website. And as you mentioned, after that, they used this event as a way to reinvigorate their marketing efforts and get back to their basics and their focus on quality, and their focus on being accountable to, not only for this crisis, but to be accountable to their customers for the quality of their product. Would you say that's basically turning lemons into lemonade?
Yeah, I think that's the most striking part of this whole response, is that they didn't just let it lie. They kind of embraced this idea of we're not perfect. And they used that as, like I said earlier, a platform for telling their turnaround story, which is fantastic. It's rare that you see an organization's leadership be willing to be that humble, but they were, and to their credit, willing to do that.
Well, one of the things that that happened to Domino's is they were criticized for not acting fast enough. As you mentioned, times are different now, and even back then they were criticized. The event happened on a Sunday, an Easter Sunday, and it wasn't until Wednesday that the company had a video out there. Here's the interesting comment from Tim McIntyre on that. On the one hand, we're lauded for doing something unprecedented, something that had never been done before, posting only a YouTube response, that is. And yet we didn't do it fast enough. How can you do something that's never been done before but not do it fast enough? He makes a good point there.
Yeah, like I said, I think that being realistic, it's a single restaurant. It's out in the middle of nowhere. You're dealing with unknown circumstances. If you can get this taken care of quietly, you don't want to call more attention to it than it justifies. So I definitely, I understand people's criticism with the speed of their response, but I definitely understand that the company's point of view in how it responded. I think, like I said earlier, I think I probably would have mirrored that even today.
What do you think Domino's did wrong?
Wrong. I can't point to a heck of a lot. Any company is susceptible to the unexpected stupidity of its workforce. So I don't know that I would be able to pinpoint things that they did wrong. Maybe if I reflect on that, or if you give me your thoughts, I'll be able to respond to or build on those. But what do you think they did wrong, Tim? I mean,
I thought I thought that the criticism was somewhat valid, that there was a slow response, because they probably could have put something out on Monday. As you said, we would put a holding statement together saying, here's what's happening. And we probably would have done that on a Monday or a Tuesday. We wouldn't have gone radio silent until Wednesday with the public. I don't blame them for not wanting to throw oxygen on a fire. But at the same time, I think we might have done a written statement. I don't know that anyone, because they were the first to do a video. I thought that was really a good way to compensate, though, for the delay. But I thought it took 48 hours for them to. But again, we're here in 2019 and we're doing a 2020 hindsight review. So even though I do think that was a mistake, I don't think it was fatal, and I don't blame them for that. I don't know that I would have done anything that much different myself.
Yeah, I guess Ad Age ran a story on that Monday, the day after the video was posted. And I guess you do have to question, well, at that point, you've got a national media entity that is calling attention to it. My understanding is that kind of spiked the number of views. It went up to 25,000 views fairly quickly, partly as a response to that. And I guess the company's point of view was, well, that's just a bunch of marketing hacks that are probably looking at this. Let's wait until we hear, more definitive consumer backlash. But again, just being realistic and having worked with plenty of CEOs and, marketing chiefs, I just think that it's highly likely that you'd want to wait for the problem to really make itself clear before wanting to make the rest of the world aware of this, by definition, very small, obscure problem.
You said you worked with some marketing chiefs, and I think there's something, this is not related to this Domino's case study, but I think it's something that happens today. And it's kind of fortunate in Domino's case is that social media was in its infancy and their social media team was in its infancy. So you had a public relations person like Tim McIntyre kind of quarterbacking this, and that was good. Because I think what happens today, and this is really a flaw, is you have crises that happen on social media, and you have social media people, not crisis management people, trying to put out the fire. And they don't have crisis experience and they don't know exactly how to handle it. So a lot of their gut instincts that are really sensational when it comes to marketing a brand can really be bad when it's a crisis situation, because they want to basically do the same thing they would do in a marketing scenario, only it's a crisis situation. Have you run into much of that, where you actually have non-crisis management people trying to put out a fire.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no shortage of corporate leaders and decision makers who want to see, they have to really be convinced that any response is necessary. And usually people like you and I are brought in long after the real value that we could conceivably provide has already been extinguished. We often get called a week or 2 weeks or a month after it became clear that there was a problem. So we're often playing cleanup rather than really working to prevent the flare up. And in a situation like this, I mean, you can easily Monday morning quarterback a lot of things that I would think that Domino's probably has instituted system-wide since. It might become as fundamental as employee communications, making sure everybody understands and appreciates and values the various components of the quality components of the brand, things like that. So there's all sorts of things that we could bring to the table as crisis planners, or at least bring to the surface. If a typical part of crisis planning is vulnerability examination, and certainly misbehavior of employees is an element of that, and making sure that employees understand and embrace everything the company stands for in terms of its vision and its values. That's an element. So if there's a schism there, if there's a separation or a gap, that usually is something that we can call out.
Well, we talked about what they did wrong, and as I mentioned, it's probably not the worst thing they could have done is to take their time, because sometimes you can be too hasty and that can create problems. But they did a lot of things right, and I'll give you a chance to think about your thoughts. But I thought they were really, really fast in catching up to the crisis and getting on top of it once they did. They wanted to identify the people behind the event and to make sure that there was that there was not a crime committed. That was their hope. So they did that. They jumped on that, and they worked with the police. They worked with the health officials. They worked with all the proper authorities. And their video that they put out on Wednesday received 330,000 views in just a few days. So even though it wasn't that sensational video that started everything and got 1 million views, their video did pretty well itself. So a lot of people saw the problem, but they also saw the statement and the corrective action that the company was taking. They started a dedicated Twitter account at a time when they didn't have that. So they did that very quickly. They strategically separated themselves from the former employees. They shut down the store for the time that they needed to do. They threw away the product that could be at risk. They apologized, and I'm not always an advocate for an apology, but when you have an act that's done and you've done everything you can to prevent future acts, what's left is an apology, and it should be a sincere one. They got rid of the food, and they were transparent throughout all of this, and they followed up, as you mentioned earlier, with that ad campaign that went on, that they continued to follow up and remain accountable. So I thought they were very, very decisive. They were very quick, and they were very credible in all of the things that they did. And I thought they were all the right things to do. Am I missing anything? Is there anything else they did right that really helped them turn this thing around pretty quickly?
Well, I always look at kind of the content of that video, and when I'm advising a client that's experiencing unwanted scrutiny like this, I always suggest that there are 3 universally applicable crisis messages. One is we care. It's you can articulate that in a lot of different ways, but ultimately it comes down to we care. The second is we're responding. We're throwing the kitchen sink at this thing. We are absolutely not going to be satisfied until it's under control and taken care of. And then the third is we're investigating, and sometimes, depending on the industry or the vertical that it's in, that might be that we're participating in the investigation because there's regulators involved or something. But the idea being that we want to understand how this happened so it never happens again. And they batted 1,000 on that in their statement. And it's interesting just to back up the fact that that is universally applicable. If you watch the Boeing's CEO video, the same messages are in that. So I think as much as anything, that was impressive to me. It was interesting if you watch that video, and it's easy to find. It's awkward the way that it's shot. It's shot kind of up, and he's not looking at the camera. So that's one thing that's quite different than today. Is I think there's an expectation today that the CEO needs to be able to face the camera and make his statement directly to the people who are watching, and which is a little different than we usually train people. But if you're going to make a YouTube statement, you need to be willing to make eye contact with that person at home. So that's kind of just a kind of a nuts and bolts take on it.
What are the lessons that we've talked about? Some of those lessons. You just mentioned one of them, facing the camera, doing those types of things, staying with it. In fact, I saw one. What oftentimes happens when there's a crisis is you have people who are crisis communicators or PR people that aren't crisis communicators, but they want some publicity for themselves. So they make comments. And somebody made a comment at the time when this happened in the press, and it sounds like it was a PR person, but they said that Domino should have pulled all of their advertising for 3 months. I don't know why, but that's what they said. McIntyre, who's a pretty direct individual, said that was probably one of the worst advice he ever heard, that they are a retail brand. And when you're a retail brand in a competitive industry like pizza, you have to advertise. You have to stay out there. So that's one thing. But what are the other lessons that may not be so apparent?
I'm reflecting on the advertising suggestion. I think that's kind of a leftover of maybe when an airline has a crash or something. I think there's kind of an industry-wide acceptance that if one of the airlines experiences a crash, you don't want to be advertising for air travel for at least a week or so. But I can't imagine 3 months off the air for Domino's, and to their credit, they took advantage of it. But in terms of lessons, I think that definitely the biggest lesson, and for a lot of people that I work with, it was there, but for the grace of God go I kind of absorption of the information that, we don't have the ability to monitor all of these channels. I think that at that time, back in 2009, those tools were just beginning to become available. I think there was Radiant 6 was being offered, but they weren't being used by everybody like they are today. So that's the biggest lesson, is to be out there listening. You don't want to be taken by surprise. You want to know what the chatter is, because, and the most important aspect of that is you can often head off the chatter very early on. If you're on the front of the wave, you can usually extinguish a bubbling problem. But if you wait, you are much more likely to be overtaken by that problem. So that's the biggest takeaway. I think that I mentioned the importance of having the CEO personally, visibly participating in the storytelling. That's another aspect of it. And then I think another really important aspect is look for opportunities to punctuate this event. And in terms of Domino's, they looked for an opportunity to put a period on this problem and then start with their turnaround. And that was a strategic decision. And I would imagine that was something that Patrick Doyle and his team were already kind of considering. I mean, when you find out that your customer base does not like the taste of your food product, that's got to be something that needs to be addressed. It's just strategically, how do you do that? And the fact that they were able to leverage this problem to then tell that story was brilliant.
Dan Keeney, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim.
To learn more about Dan Keeney and about that landmark social media crisis, Domino's YouTube PR disaster, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group that you can join, a Facebook page you can follow, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.